You've probably seen pictures like these online. Places that feel kind of oddly familiar or even nostalgic, but also feel uncomfortable. This is the phenomenon of liminal space. Liminal spaces are versions of spaces that we feel like we've been in before or that we've seen, but we can't really explain how. These are often spaces that we've kind of moved through in passing throughout our lives, like hallways and airports or even malls. But it becomes unnerving to see these spaces in a context other than how we know them, where they don't have furniture or they're dimly lit or there aren't people. Many people report that they often feel kind of dreamlike to look at, almost as if they shouldn't exist in this context. It's something that sits in the in-between of what's familiar and what's real, but also something that's not right. It's not entirely understood why these spaces evoke feelings of uneasiness, or why we may feel like we've almost been there before, making the mystery of liminal space just downright strange. Okay, if you know somebody who's experienced the horror of sleep paralysis, you need to tag or share this video with them. Every year, up to 8% of the population will experience the horrific phenomenon of sleep paralysis. You awaken realizing that your body is unable to move, leaving you in the halfway point between sleep and awake. This is often accompanied by a series of disturbing hallucinations referred to as sleep paralysis demons. People often report the feelings of pressure or suffocation, or the sensation of being dragged out of their bed, or even sensing the presence of someone else in the room. Psychologists have often debated the mystery behind this experience and have very little long-term knowledge to determine what causes it. To work your way out of paralysis, it's suggested that you get a grip on your breath and reality and focus on small movements if possible. Although you are always safe during the experience, the direct stare into something standing in your room is often too terrifying to put into words. Warning, this is a story that will contain imagery that some people will find to be distressing. This is the horrifically dark history of the freak show. Freak shows were a performative convention that actually dates all the way back to the Middle Ages, but then they were revamped in the era of circus as traveling sideshows in the early 1800s. Sideshows typically made profit off the marvel of those who had extraordinary abilities or appearances, whereas freak shows specifically were exploiting and profiting off those who were born with physical disabilities or abnormalities, as the rest of society would reject them. But there was one act in particular that stood out: Grady Stiles. Grady was born with a rare condition known as ectrodactyly, which fused his fingers and toes and left him unable to walk. You would probably recognize his character, which was adapted and made very sexy by Evan Peters in American Horror Story. But the real-life story of Grady is so much darker. Because he was unable to walk, he had developed almost unnatural upper body strength, and that mixed with a short temper and a history of alcoholism, he became abusive and dangerous. In 1978, Grady shot and killed his eldest daughter's fiance on the eve of her wedding, but due to his disability, he was sent to house arrest over prison, where his abuse continued. By 1992, his wife had had enough and somehow convinced a 17-year-old who was a sideshow performer to conspire to kill Grady. Following his death, they were both caught and sentenced, leaving the story of the great Grady Stiles just as grim as when it started. What could be more terrifying than the thought of your own body setting itself on fire? For hundreds of years, this phenomenon has been the subject of scientific scrutiny as well as deep mystery: spontaneous human combustion. This is when the human body appears to ignite internally, a fire starting from within before the entire body becomes engulfed. This actually dates all the way back to the 1600s, and since then there have only ever been about 200 cases reported worldwide. In 1984, a scientific team was assembled led by Joe Nickell to investigate a number of these cases dating back to the 1800s. One of the unusual threads that was found between all of these cases was that with every body investigated, there seemed to be some trace of alcohol in the system. This gave way to the Wick theory, suggesting that if alcohol was in the system and there was some kind of a chemical change that could ignite a fire, body fat could be used as an accelerant, making the mystery of this phenomenon one you should think about next time you're drinking. Here are 3 pictures with something dark lurking in the background. And if you're loving Creep Time and you want longer content, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel with the link in the bio. Number 1. With what kind of just looks like an overpacked truck at first, if you look a little bit closer, you might be horrified to find a small child in the back. Caught by a passing driver, all that can be seen is the head of a small boy crammed beneath the dresser. Number 2. When a wife had her camera roll developed, she thought she'd see pictures of her husband and her cat on the couch, but what she caught was horrifying. A smiling head beneath the end table. She confirmed in horror there was nothing she saw in that room after taking these pictures, leaving the face seen completely unexplainable. unbelievable. Number 3. During the attacks of 9/11, a picture was captured of what appears to be a woman standing at the impact zone. It's unknown how she could have survived the impact or what appears to be her leaning up against scorching steel, making her final photo a mystery. Here are 3 of the most disturbing mugshots on the internet. Also, if you want more creep content, make sure that you follow and you can subscribe to my YouTube with the link in the bio. Number 1. On the evening of 1990, a woman named Marlene Warren opened her front door to find another woman standing there dressed head to toe as a clown. She was holding balloons and roses, so when Marlene went to reach for some, the woman pulled out a weapon, shot, and killed her. This was a cold case for like 27 years until finally being connected to a woman named Sheila who was the husband's mistress through the late 80s. Clearly, she does not feel bad. Number 2. Provided from a Florida correctional facility, the nature of this woman's crimes were unclear, but her photo made an impact. Distressed hair with these wild eyes, it's very unsettling to stare at this shot for even more than a few seconds. Number 3. Coming in from Lakeport, Texas, this was a suspect who was apprehended following a break-in. When taken into custody, the station was kind of shocked as there's something very off about his features. Something unexplainable. Let me explain to you why this is a doll that you have to give verbal consent to see in person. You're also maybe wondering why her eyes are blocked out in these pictures. The doll was acquired by multiple curators over the last couple of decades, but it's unknown who the original owner was. What we do know is that the doll was sent away from its previous owner, and they claimed it to be the cause of severe hallucinations and said that it was moving on its own. Over the years, the doll has been subject to both historical and paranormal investigation, and there have been at least 80 documented cases of different spectators looking into its eyes and claiming experiences of nausea, headaches, chest pain, even lightheadedness. I've actually seen this doll in person in Nevada, and you do have to give consent before you go into the room. It's optional to look into her eyes, but they recommend that if you do, you greet her with hello and then finish with goodbye as a way of closure to the encounter. I am going to show you a photo without her eyes blocked, so feel free to stay, or you can scroll. On February 19th of 1994, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez was rushed to a California emergency room. She was reportedly severely confused and experiencing heart palpitations, but the medical staff noticed something was wrong here. Her skin had a sheen to it like it was slicked with oil, and her mouth had an odor of fruit and garlic. They also noticed that when they drew her blood, it reeked of ammonia and had crystal-like particles in it. But then the unusual happened. One by one, the medical staff began to pass out around her. In total, there were 23 people who fell ill, so the ER was completely evacuated as it was believed for an unknown reason her body was toxic. Following her death shortly after, examiners autopsied her in hazmat suits but were perplexed to find virtually nothing unusual in her system. There were unusually high levels of dimethylsulfone, but it's unclear what that may have contributed here. Although mostly attributed to mass hysteria, many believe there was something with her body that caused this. In 2014, 2 college students, one named Chris Kremers and the other Lisanne Froon, traveled to Panama. They were going to be put up by a host family and just do some volunteer teaching. About 2 weeks into their trip, they decided to go on a morning hike in the El Pianista rainforest, but never made it back. There is a massive search for these girls. The parents fly in, they hire investigators, but there is no trace of them for more than 2 months. That is until one of their backpacks was discovered near a riverbank 5 miles away. But not only was it completely dry, it was in perfect condition, almost like it was placed there. Not too long after, portions of the remains were found nearby, but only fragments of bones. Strangely, it was found that one of the feet of the girls had been cut off clean, right within the shoe, and there was evidence to support that they did not die at the same time. But what really chilled investigators was the analysis of the phones and the camera within the backpack. Data on their phones showed that over the course of 11 days in that rainforest, they had made 77 attempts to call for help. A probe into the digital camera showed that there were a series of 90 photos that were taken on the night of April 8th. This was 8 days after they went missing. The photos are they're kind of aimless. They're just kind of nonsensical, just of random landmarks and the rain at night. And then there was this photo, just of Chris Kremers' hair, and it's unknown if she was even alive in the picture. The mystery of their deaths is hauntingly unexplained, and what they really experienced in those 11 days we may never actually know. This is the story of the woman who walked in on her own funeral. In 2015, an Australian woman named Noella Rakundo was coaxed over the phone by her husband into leaving her hotel room. But when she left, she was met with two men who kidnapped her and were hired to kill her. But almost immediately, the two men are starting to humanize her. They're asking her questions about her life. They're asking her why her husband put a hit on her. Somehow, she convinces them just to keep the money and to set her free. Meanwhile, days have already passed and the husband's told everybody that she died in some tragic accident and he's going to be holding a funeral service. But she had details on that service. So following the funeral, everybody convenes over to the reception to continue mourning. That is until she walks through the front door. The entire room is stunned, and the husband was in such disbelief, he thought he was hallucinating. Everything comes out. He's arrested, he confesses, and the rare story of her revenge return is one that Australia remembers. We are looking at 3 pictures with something very dark lurking in the background. Number 1. So on the first night of moving into their new home, a wife just snapped a couple of pictures of her husband just relaxing on the couch right after they finished unpacking. But realized when these pictures were developed that what they caught was the outline of what seems to be a person standing in the dark of the kitchen right behind them. Number 2. Following the death of her mother in 1959, Mabel Chinnery went with her husband to take a few pictures of the new tombstone that had just been put on the plot. She ended up taking a few pictures of her husband while sitting in the car in the cemetery, but was horrified to find this, what appears to be a person sitting in the back seat. Number 3. So while the origins of this picture are kind of murky, it at face value just appears to be a girl just kind of sitting on her bed. But upon further inspection in the corner of the mattress, the face of a person can be seen hiding right below her. 3 of the most disturbing mugshots on the internet. Number 1. In 2011, Jared Loughner arrived at a Safeway where he was targeting U.S. Representative Gabrielle Giffords. Jared was a misogynist and did not believe women should hold positions of power, so he opens fire. She ended up surviving the attack, but there were 6 people killed in the process, and when he was finally apprehended, he showed no remorse as seen in this photo. Number 2. This is the booking photo of one of the scariest active gang members in California, Dion Milam. He was charged with murder but remained completely emotionless through the entirety of his trial, making this mugshot even more chilling. Number 3. There was virtually no public information I could find related to this photo, which most likely means that it was maybe substance related or a non-violent offense. But the sort of vacant and unsettling nature of the photo leaves it haunting enough that I would consider this to be one of the more disturbing mugshots I have ever seen. On the morning of January 14th, 1989, something very unusual happened on a Chicago news station. WMAQ, which is an NBC affiliate, interrupted all of their morning programming and ran this photo, a missing woman named Joanna Lopez. But viewers noticed something very off about this photo. It's completely unrecognizable. It wouldn't make sense to run this to identify anybody. That's also not typically how missing person broadcasts are shown. There's usually descriptors like height or weight, not just a phone number. Home videos caught that this was actually broadcast again in 1991 for 10 seconds before it cut away to color bars. But what's really strange is that a probe into the public records of Chicago showed that there was no woman who was missing by this name. She exists in none of the archives of missing people in 1989 for Chicago, and there is no news record of her with NBC. So who was this missing woman, and why was WMAQ showing her on their broadcast?